Hello and welcome to the first video in this 4-part series designed to show you how to create your first Windows Store app. This series is based on the Create Your First Windows Store App step-by-step tutorials found at dev.windows.com and is divided into 4 parts. This video is part 1. We'll be creating a simple Hello World Windows Store app using XAML with Visual Basic or C#. We'll show how to create a new project, add a basic layout for a page, handle a button-click event, switch between light and dark themes, and how to create your own custom style. In part 2, Manage App Lifecycle and State, we'll discuss the app lifecycle and we'll extend the Hello World app by storing app data in Windows roaming settings and saving session state data using the Suspension Manager class. Part 3, Navigation, Layout, and Views, is divided into 2 separate videos. In the first video, we'll add a photo page to the Hello World app and we'll show how to navigate between pages. We'll discuss panel controls like the grid, stack panel, and canvas controls. And finally, we'll take a tour of the key features in Visual Studio for designing page layout. In the second video of part 3, we'll show how to add an app bar for navigation, and we'll design a fluid layout for our photo page that works well in landscape, snapped, or portrait views. In part 4, File Access and Pickers, we'll add code to the photo page to call the File Picker API. We'll show how to data bind to properties of a file, and we'll revisit the app lifecycle from part 2 and show how to preserve access to a file for later use using the Storage Application Permissions class. I want to emphasize that the best way to learn is by doing. Don't just watch me write code. We designed this series so you can open up Visual Studio and follow along step by step. Before you start, to complete this tutorial, you need to have Windows 8 installed. A free 90-day evaluation of Windows 8 is available for download. You will also need to install a version of Microsoft Visual Studio 2012. You can download a free version of Microsoft Visual Studio Express 2012 for Windows 8 available from www.microsoft.com/express. You will also need a developer license. You can obtain a developer license by selecting a File New Project and building a Windows Store app, or directly from the Store menu, select Acquire Developer License. Acquire Developer License. Step 1. Create a new project in Visual Studio. To launch Visual Studio Express 2012 for Windows 8, I'm just going to type the letter VS to filter the list of apps, and I'll select VS Express for Windows 8, and that'll open up Visual Studio. From here, we're going to go to the File menu, and I'll hit Windows plus to zoom in, and select File, New Project to bring up the New Project dialog. In the left pane, make sure we're selecting Visual Basic, Windows Store, and select the blank app XAML template. And with that selected, go down to the name property, select all the text, and we're going to name this Hello World. Now if you want to, you can change the location where we're saving the project, but you can just assume the default's fine, and go ahead and click OK to create our project. Now let's switch to Solution Explorer and go through all the different files contained in the blank app project template. At the bottom is package.appx manifest, and that describes your app including name, description, tile, start page, and so on, and lists the files that your app contains. Under the Assets folder, you'll find a number of images. This includes logo images like logo.png and small logo.png, which are displayed in your start screen, store logo PNG, which is used to represent your app in the Windows Store, and splash screen.png, which is shown when your app starts. It also includes XAML and code files for app.xaml and app.xaml.vb, which is the code behind file. And scrolling down here, we also see mainpage.xaml and mainpage.xaml.vb. And this is the default start page that runs when your app starts. These files are essential to all Windows Store apps using Visual Basic. Any project that you create in Visual Studio contains them. Replacing the main page. The main page in the blank app project template is based on the blank page template. It contains the minimum amount of XAML and code to instantiate a page. However, when you create an app for the Windows Store, you must do more. For example, even a simple one-page app must adapt to different layouts and views, save its state when suspended, and restore its state when it's resumed. The other project and page templates in Visual Studio include some additional code and helper classes that help you with view and state management. When you use the blank app project template, you typically replace this blank main page with one of the other page templates to take advantage of the layout and helper classes they provide. In this example, what we're going to do is delete this main page.xaml and replace it with a page template that uses, instead of the blank page, a basic page template. To do that, from Solution Explorer, just right-click on our main page, and what we're going to do is select Delete. And I'll just zoom out here, and it'll prompt us to delete our page, and I'll go ahead and click OK. Now let's replace it with the basic page by going to Project, and I'll zoom in here, Add New Item. In the New Item dialog, select Basic Page, and for the name for our file, replace Basic Page, we need to name it the same thing as our last page, mainpage.xaml. Now that we've named our file, go ahead and click Add to add it to our project, and notice what happens. Visual Studio shows a dialog with the message that the addition depends on files that are missing from your project. What we're going to do is select Yes to add these files. So from here, just go ahead and click Yes, and Visual Studio is adding several utility classes under our common folder. Now notice here we'll actually see a message from Visual Studio saying to build the project to update the design view. And we need to click Build Solution, that's Build Solution here, to be able to see our file in the designer. Our project builds, and we should see our app directly in the Visual Designer. Step 2, start the app. At this point, you've created a very simple app. If you want to see what it looks like, press F5 to build, deploy, and launch your app in debugging mode, or we can press this button right here. Notice that the default splash screen appears first, and then your app appears. It contains a blank screen in the title, My Application. There's no button or command to close the app. You can use a close gesture, which if you see if I bring my mouse to the very top and drag it down, that would be the close gesture, or Alt plus F4 to close it. But you typically don't close Windows Store apps, as we discuss more in Part 2, Manage App Lifecycle and State. From here, let's press the Windows key to go to the Start screen. Now if we scroll to the right, we'll notice that deploying the app adds its style to the latest group on the Start screen. To run the app again, we can tap or click its style directly on the Start screen, or press F5 in Visual Studio to run it in debugging mode. It doesn't do much yet, but congratulations, you've built your first Windows Store app. To stop debugging the app, press Alt-Tab to return to Visual Studio. And in Visual Studio, you can either click the red Stop Debugging button directly here, or from the Debug menu, select Stop Debugging from here as well. And let's go ahead and select Stop Debugging to stop debugging our app. Step 3, modify your start page. From our Solution Explorer, let's collapse some of these folders so that you can see the app.xaml file, and just double click it to open it. I'm going to hide our output window by just clicking Auto Hide, and increase the zoom at the very bottom here to 140% so you can follow along a lot better. App.xaml is where you declare resources that are used across the app. This file contains a resource dictionary that has a reference to standard styles.xaml in your common folder. Standard styles.xaml provides a set of default styles that gives your app the Windows 8 look and feel. Now back in Solution Explorer, you'll see that we also have a code behind page, and that's app.xaml.vb. Let's go ahead and just double click that file to open it. And like before, I'll just increase our font size here to 140% and hit Shift-Alt-Enter to full screen this code. And what that does, if we just search for full screen at the very top of our page here, we'll see there's a keyboard shortcut, Shift-Alt-Enter, and I'll be using that throughout the tutorial. So with that, I'll go ahead and click that, and we full screen our code. And the next thing I'm going to do is right click, select Outlining, and we're going to collapse to Definitions. And notice that our app.xaml has two methods that handle activation and suspension of the app. The first one is onLaunched, and the second one is onSuspending. And we'll cover these in much more detail in Part 2, Manage App Lifecycle and State. The point here is that the XAML file that we saw earlier and the code behind this file are combined together to make a complete class. And this app.xaml file is the entry point for your app. Let's exit our app.xaml and go back to Solution Explorer, and from here, select mainpage.xaml and double click the file. And I'll zoom out, and what we see here is both a designer view and a XAML view representing the contents of mainpage.xaml. You can add elements directly using the XAML markup down here, or you can drag and drop controls, say from the toolbox, onto the design surface. Now double click on the XAML button here to open the XAML in full screen mode, and let's just set our zoom to 140%. And the first thing you'll notice is that our main page XAML is a layout aware page. This class extends the base page class and provides methods for navigation, state management, and view management. And switching back to the design view, you'll notice that it also includes some built-in controls like a back button and a page title. Just like with our app.xaml file, we'll go to Solution Explorer and expand mainpage.xaml to double-click on the xaml.vb file. I'll just zoom in here to make this a little easier to read, and we'll full screen this. And this code behind it is where we add our app logic and event handlers. Now what I'm going to do is just collapse some of these comments here, and we'll notice that the basic page template includes two methods where you can save and load state. Modify the start page. Now let's go ahead and add some content to the app. So we'll exit out of full screen mode, and we're going to switch to our mainpage.xaml, or from Solution Explorer, double-click mainpage.xaml to open it. To change the page title, select My Application, and we have it selected here. In our property window, make sure Page Title text block is selected. And under the common category, notice that we have a text property with a green property marker. The property marker is green to indicate that it's set to a resource. Go ahead and left-click on that and select Edit Resource. I'll just zoom out here, and we get an Edit Resource dialog box. Let's change the text to Hello World. And go ahead and click OK. And notice on our designer we see Hello World. And if we look at the XAML code, and let's just click this little button here to see it on split pane. And with the text block selected, notice if we go to the text property, it's set to a resource named app name. Switching back to our property menu, if we want to go to where that's defined, left click on that property marker and select Go to Source. And what that's going to do is in Visual Studio, jump directly to the XAML code where that source is defined, and we see its key is app name, and our string Hello World is defined. The next thing we're going to do is add some controls via the XAML editor. So just on the XAML editor, double click this to full screen our code, and I'll hit Shift-Alt-Enter so we have as much real estate as possible to add XAML. Now all of our UI code is going to live within this grid, and this second grid is the back button and page title, so let's go ahead and collapse that. Let's also, on the Visual State Manager, just collapse that as well. And in between these two, we're going to add our page UI. So let's add a stack panel control, and I'll hit Tab to let Visual Studio complete here, and we're going to say what row it lives in. And we're going to say it lives in row 1, which is the second row, as defined here. We're going to set a margin property, which gives us space on each side. And these spaces go clockwise, so it will be 120 to the left, 30 on top, and then 0 on the other two sides. And within the stack panel, we're going to define a set of controls. The first is a text block, and that's going to be a label. And what we want to tell people is ask them what your name is. Let's say, what's your name? And directly underneath that, we're going to add a stack panel control. We'll set the orientation to horizontal, so anything within here will go left to right. And we'll set some margin, some white space on just the top and bottom, so the left will be 0, 20 on the top, right will be 0, and 20 on the bottom. Let's add a couple different controls here. The first one's going to be a text box, and we're going to name this name input. And we'll just define a width of 300, and we'll set horizontal alignment equal to left. And next to our text box will be a button control. And we're going to set the content of this. And what we're going to do is just say hello, but we want the word hello to be in quotes. So we're going to use ampersand QUOT to show a quote. Hello, ampersand QUOT. And then I'll display the word hello in quotes. And let's just add an end tag here. And directly outside of this stack panel, we're going to add one more text block. And let's add a text block here. And what this is going to do is display our greeting output. So we'll say name. We're just going to call this greeting output. And we'll just end our tag. And we'll talk more about XAML layout in part 3, navigation, layout, and views. For now, let's exit full screen mode and click F5 or run here to see our new UI. We can type in our text box, we can type hello, for example, but of course clicking the button doesn't do anything. In the next steps, we're going to create an event handler for the button's click event that will display a personalized greeting in that greeting output text block. And we'll add the event handler code to the mainpage.vb file. Let's Alt-Tab back to Visual Studio and click Stop. Step 4, create an event handler. In this step, we're going to add an event handler to the button's click event. And in that event, we'll get the user's name from the name input text box and use it to display a greeting in the greeting output text block. Using events that work for touch, mouse, and pen input. Because they can run on a variety of devices, design your Windows Store apps with touch input in mind. Your app must be able to handle input from a mouse or a stylus. Fortunately, events such as click and double tap are device independent. If you're familiar with Microsoft.NET programming, you might have seen separate events for mouse, touch, and stylus input, like mouse move, touch move, and stylus move. In Windows Store apps, these separate events are replaced with a single pointer moved event that works equally well for touch, mouse, and stylus input. To add an event handler, go to our button control, and in the Properties menu, we're going to zoom in, make sure the button is selected, and click on the Events button to list the events for the button control. At the very top is a click event, and we're going to create a new event by just calling this button _ click and press enter. And if I zoom out, what you'll see is Visual Studio has automatically built a function event handler for button click using that name. And if we switch back to our main page.xaml here, just select that, and back in our XAML for our button, you'll notice that what's been added is this click event handler that points to button _ click. To navigate to this event handler, just put your mouse within it, right-click, and select Navigate to Event Handler. And what you'll notice is Visual Studio will jump you directly into the button click event handler. So let's add some code to set the greeting output text property. And we'll set this to hello. We'll just append a string here. And we're going to reference the name input text box and get the text property. And then just append an exclamation point at the very end. All right, we've written our first line of code. Let's go ahead and click F5 or run here. We see our page, and let's just say somebody special. I'll click our say hello, our event fires, and we see our hello somebody special for our greeting output text block. Okay, let's press Alt-Tab, switch back to Visual Studio, and stop debugging. Step 5, style the start page. It's easy to customize the look and feel of your app. By default, your app uses resources with a dark style. The system resources also include a light theme. Let's try it out and see what it looks like. To switch to your light theme, from Solution Explorer, double-click on app.xaml to open it up. And to set the theme for an application, we're going to set this as a property up here. So within this application tag, we're going to set an attribute, and we're just going to start typing. We'll see a requested theme, and we're going to choose light. And I'll go ahead and just bring this letter up here. So there's our final code that should launch the light theme. Let's go ahead and run our app here. And notice the style of our controls has changed, including the fonts and even the color of the button. Which theme should you use? Whichever one you want. For apps that mostly display images or video, we recommend using the dark theme, and for apps that contain a lot of text, we recommend using the light theme. If you're using a custom color scheme, use the theme that goes best with your app's look and feel. Using standard styles. Let's Alt-Tab back to Visual Studio and click Stop. And earlier we mentioned the standard styles.xaml that includes a number of different text styles. What we want to do is apply those styles to our text blocks. So go back to Solution Explorer, and what we're going to be doing is working within main.page.xaml, so just double click, and place your mouse in the What's Your Name text block, go to the Properties window, and make sure that we are seeing Properties, not Events, Properties here. And there's two ways you can do this. You can go down to the miscellaneous category, or just search Properties, and I'm going to search for Style, and this will give me a list of all style properties, and here we see our style property. And notice there is currently no style, but if we click the property marker, what we can do is select local resource, and from here select a number of the built-in styles from standard styles.xaml. For this text block, we're going to select basic text style. And notice what's happened to our code is that we've added that style that points to the basic text style. And let's do the same thing with the greeting output text block. Put our cursor within here to make sure that we're selecting the property for the greeting output text block. And scroll down to our style, select the property marker, local resource, and go up to basic text style and select that as the style. You should now see the basic text style property set within greeting output. Let's click F5 and run our app here. And we'll just say somebody special. And there we see our basic text style applied to those two text blocks. Let's Alt-Tab back to Visual Studio and stop debugging. Creating your own styles. You can customize the look and feel of your app by creating your own styles. Here, we're going to create a new style and apply it to the greeting output text block. With our greeting output text block selected, go to the Properties window, and under Style, click the property marker, and this time we're going to select an option to convert to new resource. And what this is going to do is create a copy that we can totally customize based on the basic text style. So select Convert to New Resource. We see a dialog here, and we're going to name our resource here, Big Green Text Style. By defining it in Application, it'll add it to our app.xaml, so go ahead and click OK. Now that it's created, what we want to do is edit it, so let's go back to our Property window here, and in the Property marker, select Edit Resource. And let's full screen this, and here we see our big green text style, and it's inherited a number of the different properties for the basic text style. Let's go ahead and change the foreground color from this theme brush to instead, let's say, green. And hit Enter. And let's replace this with 36 as the value for the font size. And let's exit full screen mode and just run our app here. Now let's type in a greeting. We'll say somebody special, say hello. And our greeting is now displayed in large green letters. Congratulations, you've completed Part 1, Create a Hello World app. In Part 2, Manage App Lifecycle and State, we'll discuss the app lifecycle and we'll extend the Hello World app by storing app data in Windows roaming settings and saving session state data using the Suspension Manager class. Hello and welcome to the second video in this four-part series designed to show you how to create your first Windows Store app. In this video, you'll learn how the app lifecycle works and how to save and restore app data and session state in a Windows Store app. Before we get started, let's review the lifecycle of a Windows Store app. As you can see in this slide, there are three possible states for an app: running, suspended, and not running. Let's start with the suspended state. An app can be suspended when the user switches away from it or when Windows enters a low power state. While your app is suspended, it continues to reside in memory so that users can quickly and reliably switch between suspended apps, resuming them. When your app is suspended and then resumed, you don't have to write any extra code to make it look as though it had been running the entire time. Your app can also be terminated. When the user closes an app by pressing Alt F4 or using the close gesture, the app is suspended for 10 seconds and then terminated. Windows can also terminate a suspended app at any time to free up memory for other apps or to save power. When the user closes an app by pressing Alt F4 or using the close gesture, the app is suspended for 10 seconds and then terminated. Windows can also terminate a suspended app at any time to free up memory for other apps or to save power. When your app is terminated, it stops running and is unloaded from memory. The important part here is that Windows notifies your app when it suspends it, but doesn't provide additional notification when it terminates the app. That means your app must handle the suspended event and use that event to save its state and release any exclusive resources. There are two types of data for you to manage in your app data and session data. App data is persistent across sessions and must always be accessible to the user. To store our app data, we'll use the roaming settings property of the application data container class. The roaming settings app data container makes it easy to store data in a way that's accessible to the user across multiple machines like a home and work PC. The data is automatically uploaded to the cloud in the background for you. Session data, on the other hand, is temporary data that is relevant to the user's current session in your app. You restore this data only if Windows suspends and terminates the app. To save session data in the navigation state of our app, we'll use the Suspension Manager class that's included in the basic page item template. Step 1. Using Suspension Manager. In Part 1, Create a Hello World app, you replace the default main page file with one based on the basic page template. Microsoft Visual Studio adds several files to the project in the common folder when we did that. One of these files contains the Suspension Manager class. Suspension Manager is a helper class that simplifies lifecycle management for the app. It does several things for you. It saves and restores the navigation state of the frame that hosts the app pages. In a single page app, saving the navigation state doesn't seem very important, but it becomes very important when you add multiple pages to an app. It also gives each page the opportunity to save and restore its state. Suspension Manager serializes the page state data and writes it to an XML file in your app's local storage. To use the Suspension Manager class in your app, you first need to register the main app frame. When you are done, Suspension Manager knows about each page in the app and it can save and restore the navigation state. To use Suspension Manager, let's collapse the common folder. And what we're going to do is double-click on app.xaml.vb to open that file. It'll increase our zoom here to 140% so we can follow along. And in the onLaunch method, let's just expand it here, what we're going to do is register the Suspension Manager. And I'll hit Shift-Alt-Enter to take us to full screen. And what we want to do is register our frame after it's created. So we see our frame is created here. Let's just add a line break. And let's call hello world.common Suspension Manager, and then use the register frame method. Now this takes two parameters. The first one's the actual frame, and we're calling our frame root frame. And the next parameter is a session state key that we're going to refer to this later. We'll just call this app frame. And we've now registered that root frame so the Suspension Manager knows about it and can save and restore the navigation state. Step 2, save the app state. Generally, there are two types of data that you want to manage in your app: app data and session data. App data is persistent across sessions and must always be accessible to the user. Session data, on the other hand, is temporary data that is relevant to the user's current session in your app. And for our app, let's switch back. Let's actually go to Solution Explorer and find mainpage.xaml and just double-click it to open it. Let's increase the size here to 140%. And we're going to scroll down to where we had our stack panel. We're going to save the greeting output text block that's displayed when the user clicks the button. That value will be saved to session state, and we'll save the name input to app data. Now always save important app data incrementally throughout the life of the app. Because your app only has 5 seconds to run code in the suspending event handler, you need to ensure that your important app data is saved to persistent storage by the time it's suspended. To save our app data, we're going to use the windows.storage.applicationData object. This object has a roaming settings property that returns an application data container. You can use this application data container to store app data that persists across sessions. Let's store the user's name in the roaming application data container as the user types it in. Note, this tutorial shows how to use roaming settings. The roaming settings app data container makes it easy to store data in a way that is accessible to the user across multiple machines. Basically, the data is uploaded to the cloud in the background for you. You can also use the local settings app data container, which is named local settings, but you should only use it when you want to store machine-specific info. Save persistent app data as often as it makes sense in your application. Here, we're going to handle the textbox.textChanged event and save the username as the user enters it. To save app data, make sure you're selecting your name input and go to our Properties window, and I'll just zoom in here. And what we're going to do is look for events, so click the event handler list. And these are in alphabetical order, and we're looking for the text changed event. In the text box for the event, we're going to name this name input text changed. And this will be the name of the function that handles the text change event. We're going to press enter, and you'll notice Visual Studio builds that event handler for us. Let's just zoom in here. And I'll full screen this as well. And we'll save the text value of that text box to a roaming settings value. And we'll do that, we'll just say dim, let's call this roaming settings, equals, and we're within the windows.storage.application data, because we're saving application data, and we say our current application data, and here we have the option to save to local settings or roaming. We're going to choose roaming settings, and hit enter. Now let's just call roaming settings.values, which is a collection of key value pairs. Let's call this username. And we'll set the username equal to the name input text property. Let's quickly review. Anytime the text box changes, the text change event will fire. We'll get a reference to our current roaming settings, and we'll set the username equal to whatever is currently typed into the text property of that text box. So far, we've been saving the text box to application data and to the roaming settings container. Let's switch back to our main page.xaml. And now that we've saved the name input text box value to application data, we now want to use session state data to save the greeting output. Session data is temporary data that is relevant to the user's current session in your app. A session ends, meaning the data is lost, when the user closes the app, uses the close gesture, uses Alt F4, reboots the computer, or logs off the computer. For a greeting output text block, we're only going to restore this value if Windows suspends and terminates the app. You need to save the navigation state of the app frame so the app can be restored to the same page it was on, and so the suspension manager knows which page to restore the state of. You also need to save the state of the page itself. We'll use the suspension manager class to save session state in the application suspending event handler. So let's exit out of full screen mode, and in Solution Explorer, double-click app.xaml.vb to open that file. Now notice that in the app.xaml.vb file, we have an event handler for the application suspending event. This event handler gets called when Windows is about to suspend your app. This is your opportunity to save the state of the app in case it gets terminated. It saves the navigation state of the app and gives you the opportunity to save the session state of the active page. The first thing we're going to do is add the async keyword to the onSuspending method signature. So let's say private async sub onSuspending. And we need to add this to any method that is going to call awaitable code. So let's go here, and right before deferral complete, let's add a line break and add a little bit of code here to await our call to helloworld.common suspension manager, and we'll call the save async method. All right, now that we've done that, let's switch over to our main page.xaml.vb and just go ahead and double click that to open that page. And we're going to go to the save state method and add some code to save that greeting output. And notice when this gets called, it has a page state variable, and what we'll do is just use our page state and set a key value here, and let's call this key greeting output text. So that's our key, and we'll set the greeting output.text property to it. So just to recap here, we're going to call save state and save up to a page state variable named greeting output text the actual text that was in the greeting output text block. And that's our session state. For our app data, we're going to use our app data roaming settings to save the username. Now let's go up to the build menu and select build solution. And you should see something like this that lets us know that our build succeeded. Step 3, restore the app state. Earlier you saw that our app.xaml.vb file contains code that handles your app's activation. There are many different ways to activate an app. Here we look at the launch activation in the onLaunch method. An app is launched whenever it wasn't running and then the user activates it. When an app is launched, Windows displays a splash screen for the app. Let's take a look at the code in app.xaml.vb. So in Solution Explorer, find app.xaml.vb and just go ahead and double click it to open it. The code defines an override for the onLaunched method. The code in this method is executed only if the activation is a launch activation. First, the code declares a frame and tries to assign the current window contents to it. If the window already contains a frame, which would be this, then the app is already initialized, so initializing the frame is skipped. If the app isn't initialized, meaning the root frame is nothing, the code creates a frame to host the app pages. You register the frame with the suspension manager, and next the code checks to see the previous execution state to see how the app was shut down. When the previous execution state is terminated, it means that the last time the app ran, Windows successfully suspended the app and then terminated it. In that case, you need to restore the app state. Next, the code checks to see if the frame contains any content. If the app is already running or the navigation state was restored, the frame already has content. Otherwise, the frame navigates to the first page in the app. In this case, it navigates to main page. Now that you know what happens when the app is launched, let's take a look at how to restore the app state. What we're going to do is add the async keyword to the onLaunch method signature. So go to the top and add async to our onLaunch method signature. And let's full screen this. And the first thing we're going to do is restore session state. Find the if statement where we're searching for application execution state of terminated. And what we're going to do is add some code to restore async using suspension manager. So we're going to await our call to helloworld.common.suspension manager, and we're going to call the restore async method. Calling restore async restores the navigation state of the frame and then gives the page the opportunity to restore its content. So let's exit out of full screen mode, and we're going to jump to our main page.xaml.vb. So just double click that file to open it, and we'll full screen here. And while previously we saved our state to page state, now we're going to go up to this load state method to load it up again. So let's add a quick comment here that says we're going to restore values stored in session state. And before we restore our data, we're going to do a quick if statement to check on our page state. We'll say page state, and we just want to make sure that there's something there, so we'll say is not nothing. And we're going to add an also. We're going to make sure that the page state actually has the key that we added. So we'll use the page state contains key method. And we're looking for the greeting output text key. And if that's true, then we do have a greeting output and we should set it. So we'll say greeting output.text equal to that page state variable, which again we called page state greeting output text. And the one thing we do want to do is call toString on this to make it a string variable since we're setting a text string. Great, so now that we've restored our session state data, the next thing we want to do is restore our app data. And by that I mean the text box value that we entered into the name input text box. So let's say restore values stored in app data. Let's say dim, let's call this roaming settings again. And if you remember, this is in windows.storage.application-data.current, and we're going to use roaming settings. Before we set the name input text box, we're just going to do a quick if statement to make sure it actually exists, and we'll say roaming settings.values, and we'll use contains key, and we're going to be searching for the username key. If that's true, then we can go ahead and just set name input.text equal roaming settings.values, and we're going to use the username string again. And we'll call the toString method to set that to the text box text property. Let's do a quick recap of what happens in load state. First, we restore session state data for the key named greeting output text. Assuming it actually exists, we find the text block and set the text property to the value in page state. And next, for our roaming settings for our application data, what we do is make sure that the username actually exists, and if it does, we're going to set the name input text box value, its text property, equal to that username. Let's exit out of full screen mode and click F5 or this run button. And first, let's just type in somebody special, hit our button. There we see our greeting value and our text input. Let's switch back to Visual Studio and click stop and click run again. Now, because the text value was saved to roaming settings, it's called in the page state and actually restored. The text value was saved anytime the text changed in that text block automatically to roaming settings. Now, the greeting output, however, was a session state variable, and that we need to do a special thing in Visual Studio to be able to test and see what happens to simulate suspending our app. So let's click say hello again, and now we know this text block has a value. And to simulate suspending, terminating, and restoring an app in Visual Studio, click Alt-Tab, and in this drop-down, I'm just going to zoom in so you can see it, select Suspend and Shut Down. So go ahead and click that. And Visual Studio simulates suspending and terminating your app, so the suspending event fires, and our session state management code is executed. Now let's run our app again, and we'll see that our session state data was loaded directly into the greeting output text block. Congratulations, you've completed Part 2, Manage App Lifecycle and State. You learned how to save and restore app data and session state in a Windows Store app. Now in the next part, Part 3, Navigation Layout and Views, we'll show you how to navigate between pages, how to add an app bar for navigation, and we'll design a fluid layout for our photo page that works well in landscape, snapped, or portrait views. Hello and welcome to Part 3 in this 4-part series designed to show you how to create your first Windows Store app. Part 3, Navigation Layout and Views, is divided into 2 videos. In this first video, we'll show how to navigate between pages, how to use panel controls like the grid, stack panel, and canvas, and how to use Visual Studio for designing page layout. Let's get started. Step 1, add pages and navigation. The first thing we're going to do is add the photo viewer page. In Solution Explorer, right-click on Hello World, select Add New Item, and that'll open up the New Item dialog box. On the left pane, make sure we're filtering by Windows Store items, and we're going to select the basic page template, not the blank page, basic page. And down here, let's go ahead and set the name here to photopage.xaml. The name is set to photopage.xaml, and go ahead and click Add to add it to our project. The first thing we're going to do is change the page title. So select My Application, and in our Properties window, let's just zoom in here. Make sure you have the page title text block selected, and under the text property, click the property marker and select Edit Resource to change that text. Let's change the value from My Application to Hello Photo. Once our page title is changed, go ahead and click OK. We should see it updated in the Visual Designer. And if we go back to our Property window and click on the property marker again and select Go to Source, it'll take us to the XAML source code, and you'll notice that the app name key is now set to Hello Photo. Next, we're going to add navigation. The XAML UI framework provides a built-in navigation model that uses frames as parents and pages as children that we navigate in between. This works much like the navigation in a web browser. The frame control host pages and has a navigation history that you can use to go forward and back through pages you visited. You can also pass data between pages as you navigate. In Part 1 and Part 2, we looked at the code in app.xaml.vb that creates a frame and then uses the navigate method to navigate to main page when the app first starts. Now what we're going to do is add a command to main page to navigate to this new photo page in the same way. To navigate between pages, in Solution Explorer, double-click mainpage.xaml to open it. So select our main page and go ahead and just double-click it to open it. And let's double-click our XAML editor to make this full screen. And we'll select 140% so we can see. In the XAML editor, go ahead and just scroll down until you find the stack panel that were created in the previous steps. And what we're going to do is add a button element for our navigation, and we're going to add it right after this greeting output. So I'm just going to add a line break here, and we'll add some XAML to add this button. And we'll say button, let's give it a name, and let's call this photo page button. And for the content property, this is what's displayed on the button. We'll say go to photo page. Now we could add a click event handler directly in XAML for this button, or what we can do is go to the Properties view and select Events, and under the click event for the photo page button, what we're going to do is add a new method, and we'll call this photo page button underscore click. And when we click enter, Visual Studio will automatically build that event handler for us. Now I'm just going to zoom in the IDE a little bit so we can see the code. And we'll do a quick if statement to make sure that me.frame is not nothing. And assuming there's actually a frame that exists, we can call the navigate method on it and say me.frame.navigate. And we're going to navigate, and we'll say to the get type, because it needs a type, and the type is going to be photo page. Now what happens is when you click an event, we make sure the frame actually exists, then we call the navigate method and navigate to the photo page. Let's go ahead and click run here so we can see this in action. Here's our Go to Photo Page button. When we click it, notice that it jumps to the photo page. Now if you remember, when we built the photo page, we used the basic page template. That template uses a layout-aware page class, and that has built-in support for navigation. The back button over here, this uses the frame history to go back to the previous page, and is shown only when the frame.canGoBack property is true. And if we click this, we automatically jump back to the Hello World page, and we can navigate between pages. And the nice thing is we didn't have to write any extra code to be able to navigate back to the previous page. It's just already built into the layout-aware page class. Step 2. Add controls and content to a page. Before we add controls to our photo page, we're going to review the XAML layout system and Visual Studio features for designing UI. The XAML layout system supports both static and fluid layouts. What we're going to do is look at some examples of container controls like the grid, stack panel, and canvas, and show how they have both static and fluid layouts. The XAML layout system provides various panel controls such as grid, stack panel, and canvas that serve as containers in which you arrange your content. Use a grid control to arrange content in rows and columns. The Visual Studio templates include grid controls. For example, this grid, the layout root style grid, contains 2 rows. The first one containing the back button and page title, and the second row, which is row 1, contains the rest of the page layout. As you can see, there are 2 row definitions. The first is a height of 140, and the rest is a star, meaning it takes up the rest of the available space. If we scroll down, we see that within here, we actually have another grid, and that's the back button and page title grid. As you can see, there are 2 column definitions. The left column, which will auto-resize based on the content, as well as the second column, and that will automatically resize based on available size. Now both the button and text block are part of this grid. In the page title text block, we set the grid.column attach property to equal 1 to signify that we are in the second column, since the column numbers start at 0. Now the back button doesn't include an attach property for grid.column, and what that means, it's going to default to grid.column equals 0, meaning the first column. Another commonly used control is the stack panel. So let's click on this and see this stack panel. You use a stack panel to arrange content on a single line. You can set the orientation property to stack items either vertically or horizontally. Here we're stacking 4 different images from our assets logo PNG file. The max height property specifies the values that constrain the size of this element while allowing fluid resizing. We can also set the margin property. The margin property specifies the amount of empty space around the control between the outside of the child object and the boundaries of the panel. The margin property takes 4 values, starting with the left and going clockwise: left, top, right, bottom. We can, for example, set the margin property of this particular image to add some space between the last image in the panel. By setting this to 200, we now have 200 pixels in between those 2 images. Now another commonly used panel control is the canvas control. Let's scroll down so you can see this in the Visual Designer. Use a canvas when you want to control all aspects of positioning and sizing of content. In a canvas, you position elements absolutely using canvas.top and canvas.left attach properties. A canvas doesn't do any sizing of child elements, so you have to size them explicitly. To show how to position controls inside of a canvas, what I'll do is show the toolbox, and we'll drag and drop a radio button and another radio button. And let's just zoom into 120%. And now what we can do is, as we move this item, notice the canvas.left and canvas.top properties change to be able to show where we are positioning this. And notice as I move my radio button, Visual Studio comes with visual guides that show me how to align these 2 controls. Now I'm going to zoom out of our view here and go to, say, 33%. And the point I want to show here is that you can use both static and fluid layouts together. For example, instead of having a static height of 300, if we delete this property, you'll notice that the container automatically resizes to take the full height of the available space in grid.row equals 1, or the second row. And we can set other properties, for example, the horizontal alignment equal to left. Now the horizontal alignment specifies what position an object takes in relation to its parent object. And now our canvas is left aligned on this grid. Now the width and height are fixed values measured in pixels. Now what I can do is delete these properties, and you'll notice that our canvas automatically resizes to take as much available space in the second row. And the reason for this, if we scroll back up, is because our row definition says star, which is take all available space. To see the first row auto size, we'll increase the max height to 400, and notice that the first row has auto size to 400, and the bottom row has taken up whatever remaining space, which is that blue canvas. Later on in the tutorial, we'll use these containers and layout properties to create a fluid layout for the photo viewer page. Next is XAML layout tools. In part 1, we added controls to the main page by entering XAML directly into the XAML editor. But Visual Studio also includes a visual XAML designer that you can use to add and arrange controls. Now let's switch back to our Hello World project, and let's take a quick tour of the features available in Visual Studio Express. The first thing we want to show is Solution Explorer. Solution Explorer contains a list of all the files and assets within our Visual Studio project, and as we've seen, you can just double-click on any file to open them. Now once you have a large solution, what you can do is use the Search Solution Explorer to actually search within the contents of your project. So for example, let's search for main page. And by doing this, we see a filtered list of all files that start with main page, like mainpage.xaml and mainpage.xaml.vb. Let's go ahead and double-click on mainpage.xaml to open that page. The next thing we want to do is show the XAML designer. So notice our page opened in the XAML editor. If we take our mouse to the very bottom and double-click the Design button, that'll open up the page in the XAML designer. The XAML designer allows us to visualize the XAML that we're building. And what we can do is use the Toolbox window. On the left side where you see Toolbox, go ahead and click that. And what you're going to want to do is pin this. So click the little pin to pin it so that it's always visible. And the Toolbox allows us to drag and drop controls onto the visual designer. Like Solution Explorer, we can use the Search Toolbox feature to search for particular controls. In our case, let's search for a button. And we see all the available XAML controls that are buttons. And from here you can, of course, drag and drop any controls onto your design surface. The next feature we want to show is our device settings. So at the very bottom here, go ahead and click Device to show this. And to better see this in action, I'm going to resize our designer using this drop down here to 33%. And I'll go ahead and click that so we can see our full visual designer. And I'll just move this around so that our page is within the center. As you see in the device window, it includes a number of different settings. For example, we can remove the Chrome that removes it from the visual designer. Just turn it back on. We can also change the view, for example, to snapped view to see what our page looked in the snapped view state. And we can easily toggle between any of these different views. We can also simulate different visual states that are defined in our page, like filled, full screen portrait, snapped, and so on. And we can also use this to simulate different display types, all the way down to 2560 by 1440 with 109 dpi. Now the next tool I want to show is the document outline. We see it here on the left side. Just by clicking on this button, we'll click it, our document outline appears. And again, we'll click this to pin our window. Let's zoom out and let's go ahead and hide our device window so we just see our document outline. Now the document outline is a visual tree of all the controls in our page. This enables us to arrange and navigate different controls in our page. For example, for this grid, we can click on the eye icon to toggle the visibility on and off so that way we're clear on what this grid actually is within the visual design surface. And under that grid, we see our back button and our page title control. Now we can also use our document outline to rearrange controls. So if we expand our stack panel, select our button, and what we can do is change the order of the stack panel to have the button appear before the text box and easily change that back and forth. And we can of course also change the parent control that this button lives inside of. The next thing we want to do is talk about the Properties window. And this is a window we've been using before. And with our button selected, notice that we're listing the events and the event handlers, and we have a button click event listed here. And if you double click this, it'll jump you directly to the event handler. Let's switch to the Properties view. Now there's a lot of different properties available for us, and we can choose different ways to navigate this Properties window. The first is by Arrange by Category. And these are the categories listed here. And you can expand each of these different areas to see the properties within each category. You can also search properties by name. So I'll click that. And the difference here is this is an alphabetical list of all the properties. I'll switch this back to categories for now. And just like the other windows in Visual Studio, we can also search our properties. So if we start typing content, and we scroll to the top here, we'll see that under comment, we have the button's content property. And this includes all the list of properties that have the word content within it. Now one of the reasons people like the property window is that it gives you a visual representation of the data. So for example, if we just start typing a line here, you'll see that we have a visual representation of the horizontal alignment and vertical alignment properties. Here we see our button has a horizontal alignment of left and a vertical alignment of center. And we can change other properties, for example, the margin property. And here we see a visual representation of us setting the left, right, top, and bottom margin properties for this button control. The next feature we want to show is the XAML editor. To show our XAML editor, at the very bottom, we see the word XAML, and go ahead and double click that to open it up. And I'll just zoom in here to 140% within our editor to make this a little easier to read. And we'll use Shift-Alt-Enter to go to full screen. Now, as you've seen as we've been writing our code, we get IntelliSense for any elements and attributes for these XAML controls. And another nice feature within the XAML editor is if we right-click and select Outlining, and we're going to toggle all outlining, select Toggle all outlining, and we just need to do this twice to toggle everything again. Now what we've done is collapsed everything to that common layout aware page class. And as we expand it, we see that all the items within here for both the page resources and grid are also collapsed. This makes it easy to navigate large XAML pages. For example, if we want to see what's inside our code, we'll go into the grid and we'll see the 3 different pieces within here. Our back button and page title, the stack panel we've been building, and the visual state manager are the 3 things that make up the layout root style grid. Now if we expand our stack panel, another handy feature we can use in the XAML editor is to be able to jump to the event handler. So if we expand our stack panel, we see our click event, and if we right click and select Navigate to Event Handler, that'll make it easy for us to navigate directly to this method in the code behind. So once we're in the code view for this button click event, there may be times where we want to be able to navigate back to where we were in that XAML page. And what we can do is use Control and minus, and that'll jump us back to that button click. So we can right click the button to navigate to Event Handler, and anytime we want to jump back to that XAML page, we hit Control minus to navigate back. Now let's exit out of full screen mode, and what we can use is the XAML tab or the Design tab to switch between these in full screen mode, or on this side what we can do is use the horizontal split button, that's this horizontal line, and what that'll do is navigate this code to show both the XAML and the designer. Now if we want to switch the panes that this code is in, we can click the Swap Panes button, and now our designer is on top, and our XAML code is underneath it. As you're using Visual Studio, you may accidentally close some toolbar windows, and what you can do is go up to the View window, and what you'll see here, if I just zoom in, is the ability to reopen any of these windows, for example, the Solution Explorer, the Output window, and so on. You can also use the keyboard shortcuts to toggle the visibility of these windows on and off. Another feature that you may want to use is the Reset Window Layout. Under Window, we'll see an option to Reset Window Layout. Let's just zoom in here. What this will do, if you click it, you'll see you'll get a dialog that says, are you sure you want to restore the default window layout for the environment? And I'll zoom out and we'll see that our windows, for example, our document outline and so on, will reset to their default values. I'll click yes, and you'll notice these windows automatically collapsed. And the final handy feature is in the top right, and that's the Quick Launch window. And if we type in here, for example, let's type full screen, we see our command for the View Full Screen and the keyboard shortcut. And we can, for example, search for all different kinds of things. For example, to pull up the Properties window, if we don't know how to find that, we just type Properties, and we'll see it's under View, Properties window, as well as the keyboard shortcut for that as well. Now Visual Studio has a lot of different commands to offer, and you can use the Quick Launch window to find and discover those commands. Congratulations, you've completed the first video in Part 3, Navigation, Layout, and Views. You learned about page navigation, panel controls like the grid, stack panel, and canvas, and how to use Visual Studio for designing page layout. In the next video, we'll show how to add an app bar, and we'll use Visual Studio to design a fluid layout that works well in landscape, snapped, or portrait views. Hello and welcome to the second video of Part 3, Navigation Layout and Views. In this second video, we'll show how to add an app bar for navigation, and we'll design a fluid layout for our photo page that works well in landscape, snapped, or portrait views. Step 2 continued. Add controls and content to a page. Let's go to the Solution Explorer, and in our Hello World project, go ahead and double-click the mainpage.xaml to open that up. Now we're primarily going to be using the designer, so let's go ahead and just select this design, double-click here to hide the XAML editor. And I'll resize this value here just so we can see more of our designer. We'll choose 66% here, and I'll zoom out, and let's just make sure whatever we can is visible to us. And for this, we're also going to dock our document outline, so we see it here, click on it, and we're going to pin it so we can always see it. So just click on the little pin here. And now we see the document outline pinned to our left side. In our document outline, what we're going to do is select the page root element, select page root, and go back to our properties window in the bottom corner here. We'll zoom in and make sure we have our page root, which is of type layout aware page. And what we're going to do is just clear the search here, and we'll expand the common category. And under here, what we're going to do is search for the top app bar property, and go ahead and click New. And we now have an app bar, and we can see that if we jump back to our document outline, we'll see that under our page root, we have a top app bar. We can go ahead and select that top app bar. And what we're going to do is in our app bar, we're going to take our Go to Photo Page button and add it as an item underneath this app bar. To do that, let's go ahead and expand this grid, and expand our stack panel, and with our Photo Page button selected, go ahead and drag and drop it so that this Photo Page button is now inside the app bar. And what we want to do is make sure we have that Photo Page button selected, and right now our button's on the left, we want it to be on the right. So to do that, let's go to our Properties window, and with our Photo Page button selected, if we just start typing horizontal here, and I'm going to set this to right, and if we zoom out and just move our page here, we'll see that our button is now aligned to the right. Let's go ahead and click F5 or just run our app. And what I'll do to show the app bar is just right click, and you'll see our app bar appeared, and there's our Go to Photo Page button. And we can click our button and of course navigate back to our Hello Photo and back again to our Hello World. Let's switch back to Visual Studio and just click Stop Debugging. And next what we're going to do is style our app bar button. In Solution Explorer, under the Common folder, go ahead and expand this. Go ahead and double-click our standard styles.xaml to open it. So let's hide our document outline window and just go to 140% so you can read along. And what we're going to do is hit Control F to bring up the Find window, and we're going to search for a specific style that's declared in here, but it's commented out, and that's called Pictures App Bar Button, and you see it here, the app bar button style. And I'll just go ahead and close our Find window. And as you can see here, this is a style for a button that's used in an app bar. And there's a number of these different reusable styles that you can take for your app to design your app bar. And we just need to select the whole style, and I hit Control X and Control V to copy and paste this. So now this style name is going to be available for us to use in our app. Now let's switch back to our main page.xaml. And with our photo button selected, let's go to our property window. And we're going to do a couple things here. First, let's clear the horizontal search. And what we want to do is find the content property. And on the property marker, what I'm going to do is click Reset. And Reset's just going to clear the value that was in here before. Next, we're going to set the style property, and we'll just type style. And we'll scroll down here. Under miscellaneous, we'll see our style property. And click on this little property marker here. Select local resource, and this shows us all the styles that we can apply to this button. And what we're going to do is apply that newly uncommented out Pictures App Bar Button style. So go ahead and select that. Now that we've set this style, we can see that it's actually updated in the designer. And better yet, let's go ahead and click F5 or just run our app here so we can see this in action. And go ahead and right click to bring up the app bar, and notice we're now using that built-in style from standard styles that was uncommented. Let's switch back to Visual Studio and go ahead and stop debugging. Now let's go back to our Solution Explorer, and we'll just collapse the comment, and what we want to do is go to Photo Page.xaml, double click it to open it. Let's go to the design view and just double click the word design to hide the XAML editor. And now what we're going to do is add a grid control. So go ahead and just expand our toolbox and click the little pin button here to pin it. And this grid's going to have 3 rows. The first 2 are fixed size, while the last one takes all the available remaining space. So let's start by adding the grid control. Go ahead and click and drag that anywhere onto our designer, kind of in the middle here. And you can see by default this is actually selected since it has the blue grid lines here. So let's change some of the properties. Let's switch back over to the properties window. First, let's give our name to our grid, and let's call this content grid. And I'll click enter. And just by adding this control on here, Visual Studio already set a number of different properties for us, including the height, the width, horizontal alignment, margins, and so on. And since we want our grid to have a flexible layout, we'll just go ahead and reset those properties. And we can do this either in the property window or just by deleting the XAML in the XAML editor as well. Now the first property we're going to reset, let's just clear this and type width. So go ahead and click on the property marker, and we're going to change it from 100 to reset this, and now it'll auto resize the width. And let's do the same thing with the height. So we search for height. Let's reset this, and this will go to auto. Let's go to our horizontal alignment as well. Click the property marker, click reset, so that way there is no horizontal alignment. And same thing with vertical. We just start typing vertical alignment, click the property marker, click reset. So we've reset the values for width, height, horizontal, and vertical alignment. And if we zoom out here, what we'll see is in our designer, we do have a couple different properties, like this margin property of 600. We want to go ahead and just change the margins for our grid. Let's go back to our property window, and let's type margin. And let's change some of these margin properties. For example, let's set the left margin to 120. We'll set the bottom margin to 120. And we don't actually need a top margin here, so we'll set that to 0. And this is what this is going to look like in our visual designer. Now we've set up the basic positioning for our content grid, and it aligns well with our hello photo text. The next step we're going to do is build our rows. To do that, we're going to use the Visual Studio Designer. Now notice what happens when I put my cursor directly on the left side of this grid. I see that the line changes, and I get that little plus icon on my cursor. And what this is telling me is anytime I click, I'm going to be creating a row in this grid. And the orange line represents where the grid line for this row will actually be. And it doesn't really matter where. Let's just click 1, and let's go ahead and do the same thing. Maybe we'll do another one down here, and go ahead and just add that row. Now we should have a 3-row grid, 1, 2, 3. So to make this a little easier to view, I'm just going to make sure we're all the way on the left side to see these actual numbers. Make sure we have our content grid selected. And if we zoom in here, just by holding our mouse over this, what we see is this little drop down that lets us select how we are defining the size for our row. So what we're going to do is change the way we're sizing this row. We're going to select pixel sizing. And now what we can do is select this value, and we're going to change the height of the row to 50 pixels and click enter. Now if we just mouse over, we see that this is now 50 pixels. Now let's do the same thing for the second row. Select the drop down, select pixel, and now what we want to do is change this value to 70. And now we've set the first row to 50 pixels, second to 70, and this is now star-based. And star-based is basically going to say it's going to use any available space. All right, we've been playing in the designer. Let's actually see what the XAML produce. So double click on the XAML tab, and it'll increase the zoom to under 40% to read along. And let's scroll down until we find our content grid, which is this one. And you'll see we have 3-row definitions, height of 50, 70, and this one will default to star. Next, we're going to add some controls to our photo page. So jump back to our designer, double click design here, and let's make sure we can see our document outline, and we'll pin this. And let's make sure both our toolbox and our document outline are visible. And in document outline, click on content grid so it's selected. And what we're going to do is drag a button onto the top content grid. So go ahead and just drag that on to the first row. And like we did previously, let's make sure our button is selected, and we're going to go to our property window and just reset a number of these different properties. So our button's selected, and let's type horizontal, and we want to reset the horizontal alignment. So click on the property marker and click reset. Same thing with vertical. Click on the property marker and click reset, as well as any margin values that happen to be in here. So let's go ahead and select the property marker for the margins and click reset, and that'll zero those out. Now let's search for the content property. And right now this is set to button. What we want to do is set this to a little better text, and we'll set this to get photo. Now that we have our button set up, and we can just zoom in here and make sure to hit enter on the get photo content bar text box. There's our get photo. We're now going to add a text block control into our second row. So scroll down where you see a text block and just drag that into the second row. And we're going to need to do the same thing here. So let's go to our properties window, and we're going to zero out a number of these different properties. So first is going to be horizontal alignment. Select the property marker, select reset. Select vertical alignment, property marker, click reset. In our margin property, so let's just search for margin, hit the property marker, and click reset. Next, we're going to set its style property. So let's just search for style. And under here, if we just scroll down, we'll see a style property. And hit the property marker. Under local resource, you'll see a number of these different styles that are defined in standard style. We're going to select the page subheader text style. So go ahead and click that. If we zoom out, now if we just zoom in, we'll see our style applied to that text block. All right, the next thing we're going to do, and let's make sure we're in our content grid, what we want to do is drag and drop a stack panel into that third row. So go ahead and add that. And we'll go to our properties window and do a lot of the same things that we've already done before, which is to reset these values. First, we'll do horizontal alignment. We'll click the property marker, click reset. Same thing with vertical, property marker, reset. Next, let's reset the width. It's currently 100. We'll reset it, which will auto resize it. Let's set the height. Do the same thing. We'll reset, which will auto size it. And let's also go in here and make sure the margin is reset. And click the property marker and reset. Now that we're done resetting the layout, what we want to do is set the orientation of our stack panel from vertical to horizontal. Let's give our stack panel a name. Let's call it image panel. And go ahead and hit enter. Now the next thing we're going to do is add a border control to our image panel. So in the document outline, just make sure you have the image panel selected. And let's go up here. These are in alphabetical order, so I'll select the border control and just drag it on. And you'll notice the border became a child of the image panel. And back to our properties window again, and we're going to change some of the properties for our border control. And what we're going to do is expand the brush category, and we want to set the background brush for this border. So to do that, right now we have no brush selected. Click the solid color brush, and you'll see we get this nice color picker here. But we're going to go ahead and just set a hexadecimal value. So under here, set these values to 80, 80, 80, and hit enter. And you'll see just by mousing over it, that's our current color. Now that we've set the background brush, let's go back up and change the border brush. Now what we can do in our border brush, if we scroll down here, we can either set the hexadecimal value again, or we do have this nice button here to select the last color, which will automatically fill in the last color, which was that 80, 80, 80. And if we scroll up, we'll see that both our background and our border brush buttons are set. Now that we have our border set up, what we're going to do is go back to our toolbox and scroll down to where we see an image control. And go ahead and select that image, and we're going to drag and drop it directly into that border control. And let go. And we can, of course, go to our document outline and make sure that we've done it correctly by making sure that the border has a child element, which is that image control. And with our image selected, let's go back and set up some properties for this. First thing we're going to do is call our image, and we'll just name this display image and hit enter. Now under properties, let's go ahead and set the source property. And you see we have a drop down here. And these are just the built-in images from the assets directory. And let's select logo.png. And if you see, there's our logo PNG background. Next, let's switch back to our border control. Go ahead and select it and go back to our property window because we want to change one more property here. And just type in width, and you'll see it's set to the default width of 100, which you see there. Let's go ahead and reset that value. we'll notice the width is auto, and our image actually got larger as well. And what it did here, if we go back to our content grid, and we see this is set to star size, so it increased its size based on whatever available space there was within these text blocks, knowing that we had a certain margin within our grid. And this value, 388 for the width of the border, may be different based on the resolution of your machine. In our next step, we're going to add the image info. In your document outline window, let's zoom in and make sure you have the image panel, stack panel selected. What we're going to do is select the text block control. Go ahead and select that. And we're going to drag and drop that directly into our stack panel. And this should end up directly to the right of your image. Now, since we drag and drop this into a stack panel, we don't have to reset the properties like we did with the other controls, where we're resetting horizontal alignment, width, and so on. So with our text block selected, just zoom in here, and instead what we're going to do is set the text of this property, and what we want to do is set this to file name. So let's scroll up. We see the text block property, and we'll call this file name. And now that we've done that, we're going to zoom out and go back to our toolbox and drag 5 more text blocks on. So there should be a total of 6. Let's just do 2, 3, 4, 5, and of course 6. What we're going to do is each text block is either going to be a label, like file name, or an actual value based on the property information we get for the selected file. So this will be the file name. This will be the value for that. The next one, we want to set this value. So I'm going to select it. And under text, let's zoom in here. And what we're going to do is just label this path. OK, let's zoom out, go back to our text blocks. So we have the file name, then we'll set the actual value. The path label, the actual value. And now select this one, which is the second to last one, or the 5th one. And let's set that label. So go back here. And we're going to call this date created. And hit enter. So we still need to fix the layout and formatting of these text blocks, and that's what we're going to do next. So let's jump into our document outline, select the first text block, and hold down Shift and click to select the last text block, and every text block within should be selected. Now with all of them selected, right-click and select Group Into, Stack Panel. So let's just zoom in. With all those selected, Group Into, Stack Panel. And I'll zoom out. So what's happened here is, if you can see, we just expand that newly created stack panel, and it includes all of our text blocks within it. Now that we have all the text blocks in that stack panel, make sure it's selected, and you'll see these are all horizontal. What we want to do is make this vertical. So let's go to our Properties window. In our stack panel, let's just reset this and select Orientation. And let's select Vertical Orientation. And if we zoom out, we'll now see all these values are in a vertical orientation. Next, let's switch back here and select our margin value. And we'll set this to 20. And I'll zoom out. And what you'll see is that stack panel, once I hit Enter, will move over 20 pixels. So what we're going to do next is apply some styles to these labels, like the file name, path, and date created. And to do that, we can just do this by selecting the first, the third, and the 5th text block. And to select these, I'm using Control-Click to select each one I want, and you can use Control-Click to untoggle which ones you want to select. Now with those 3 selected, if we go to our Properties window, we'll notice it'll tell us there's 3 objects selected. Let's reset this and type in our style, because we want to add a style to these text blocks. So if we scroll down under Miscellaneous, we see our style, click the property marker, and much like we've done before, hit Local Resource, and this time we're going to set this to the Caption Text Style. Now let's jump back, and we need to apply some styles to these other ones. So that's the second, click the first one, Control-Click the 4th, and Control-Click the 6th text block. And these are the ones that should say text block on them. And let's go to our Properties window. And again, notice here we have 3 objects selected. We have our style property, hit the property marker, and local resource. And now the style we're going to use is called Item Text Style. So let's apply that. And before we leave here, let's actually set the margin properties for these text blocks. I'll set this to 10 left and 30 on the bottom. Now if we see here, we've actually formatted this and there's a nice margin in between all these different values. So far we've been changing values in the Visual Designer. If we switch back to our XAML Designer, what we can see is that we've actually been setting these properties, and I'll just full screen this, and you can see the static resource for the different styles that we've been setting, the margin values that we've been setting, and so on. Alright, so we finished mocking up our UI. Why don't we go ahead and just run this so we can see this in action. Right-click, select Pictures, and here we see what our mock-up of the UI that we just designed. The next thing we're going to do is add some code to adapt this page not just to the landscape, but also to the portrait and snapped orientations. Let's switch back to Visual Studio and just stop. Step 3. Adapt the page layout to different orientations and views. In our Hello World project, let's go to the Solution Explorer, and what we're going to do is select the photo page.xaml and just double-click it to open it. And make sure that we are in the designer, so just select the designer here to open it up, and we'll just size this to say 50%. Let's go ahead and just move our design surface. Great. What we want to do is see our photo page XAML in different views. So to do that, what I'm going to do is switch over to the Device tab down here, go ahead and click that, and you'll see that we have a number of different options for view, like landscape, filled, snapped, and so on. First, let's try filled. Let's click that, and what you'll see here is this assumes another app is snapped here, and our application UI looks fine. Now look at what happens if we say zoom in here and select snapped view. We see that our image is cut off, and we can't see any of the metadata about our image as well. Now let's go ahead and test the portrait view as well, so go ahead and click that. And this view is a bit too narrow, as again we're getting data cut off on our image. So we're going to need to make some adjustments, just like we're going to have to for our snapped view. So let's start with our snap view, so go ahead and click that and click snapped view. And again, just make sure that the snapped one is selected. And what you'll notice is we are in the snapped visual state. And let's just expand this a little so you can see the label. And what we're going to do is click this checkbox to enable state recording. And notice what happened in Visual Studio. At the very top of our photo page.xaml, we see snapped state recording is on. And what that means is as we make changes to our visual layout, the visual layout changes are only applied to the current snap state. And the changes are made to the Visual State Manager included in our photo page XAML file. So now that it's recording what we're doing, let's go to our document outline, expand our grid, and select our content grid here. What we're going to do is with the content grid selected, let's go back to our content grid property window, and we're going to change some of the margins. So first, instead of having a 120 pixel margin, let's go ahead and make this 20, and we'll set the bottom to 20 as well, and hit enter. So that made this a lot smaller of a margin. And next, let's expand our content grid, and within here we see our image panel, stack panel. So just make sure that's selected. Let's go to our property window, and we'll make some changes here as well. With our stack panel selected, what we're going to do is just search for the orientation property and set it from horizontal to vertical. And just by making that simple change, what you'll see is our stack panel now changed to be vertical, so we can even see the file name and text blocks, all the data that was cut off before in this snapped view. This is an example of a fluid layout. The stack panel lets its child elements stretch in the direction that it's oriented and constrains them in the opposing orientation. Instead of setting the image to a fixed size, you let the layout panel arrange inside its child elements. Now that we can see everything in our snapped view, what we're going to do is select the portrait view. Let's go back up to our device window and select portrait. By default, Visual Studio will turn off Enable State Recording when you switch views, so let's go ahead and click it on again. So with our full screen portrait state recording on, and in our document outline, let's make sure our image panel is selected. We're going to do the same thing that we did in our snapped view. Let's scroll down here. We see our image panel selected, and we're going to change the orientation from horizontal to vertical. And now let's set the margin property here. And what we'll do is just set a right margin of 20. And I'll just zoom out, and maybe we'll change the size here so we can see everything a little better. Let's select 33%. And here that we're able to see, we see the image border and all the text blocks control as well. Now switch back to landscape view. And now what we'll do is just double click on XAML to open up the XAML view. We'll zoom to 140%. And at the very bottom of our page, we'll see that we have this Visual State Manager, Visual State Groups. So what's happened here is by using enabled state recording, it's recorded the changes to our properties. For example, our target property of stack panel orientation changes to vertical. Similarly, if we scroll down to our snap view, we see that, for example, we set our margin values. And if we scroll to the right here, we see that storyboard target name, that's changing the margin for the content grid. And here what we're doing is changing the image panel. And just like we did before, we're changing the orientation from horizontal to vertical. The nice thing about changing these values is that Visual Studio did it for us, and all we had to do was change some values directly in the Visual Designer. Congratulations, you're done with the second video in part 3, Navigation, Layout, and Views. You learned how to add an app bar and how to design a fluid layout for our photo page that works well in landscape, snapped, or portrait views. Hello and welcome to the fourth and final part in this 4-part series designed to show you how to create your first Windows Store app. Now in this video, we're going to call the File Picker API. We'll show how to data bind to properties of a file, and we'll show how to preserve access to a file for later use using the Storage Application Permissions class. Let's get started. The File Picker enables your app to access files and folders on the user's PC. When you call the File Picker dialog, the user can browse their system to select which files or folders your app can access. After the user picks files or folders, your app receives those picks as storage file and storage folder objects. In the next step, we're going to data bind our photo page to a storage file. To do that, we're going to set the storage file to the data context property for the photo page. Data context property lets you set the default binding for an entire UI element, including all of its child elements, like the text block controls on the photo page. When you establish a binding and the data source changes, like when a user selects a different photo, the UI elements that are bound to the data source reflect the changes automatically. Once the data context is set to a file, we can then add the data binding path for the text block controls to properties of the storage file class, for example, the file name, date created, and so forth. Step 1. Use a file picker to get an image file. In our Hello World project, go to the Solution Explorer and select photopage.xaml by double-clicking on it. And once it's open, what we're going to do is select the Get Photo because we're going to add a button click event handler for it. So make sure it's selected, and then go to our Properties window. And under here, we're going to switch to the Events tab, and you'll see a list of events, and we're going to add a click event. And let's call this Get Photo Button _ click, and hit Enter to go ahead and build that method. Now let's take this to 140% zoom and full screen by using Shift-Alt-Enter. And in the button click event, we're going to open a file picker to let the user select a picture from their pictures library. When they pick a file, we're going to set it as the source for the image, and we're also going to set the data context for the page so that we can data bind the different properties for that file. Now since we are going to be using some async file I/O here, we do want to make sure that we mark this method with the async keyword. And the first thing I'm going to do here is just copy paste a comment. Now what this comment is saying is that the file picker APIs don't work if they're in the snap state. Our first set of code is going to check if our application view state is set to snapped, and if it is, we're going to try and unsnap it. So let's get started here. I'll say if windows.ui.viewmanagement.applicationView.value does not equal application view state of snapped. Just add a line break here. The next thing we're going to do is call the try unsnap. So we'll say or else. Let's go ahead and try that unsnap here. Windows.ui.viewmanagement application view try unsnap and see if that's true. And if it is, then we want to show our file picker. So let's build a variable to represent our file picker, and I'll just call it openPicker equals, and I'll say a new windows.storage pickers And in this case, we're going to pick the file open picker. Now we're going to set a couple properties here for our file picker. We'll say open picker. First one is the suggested start location. And we'll say, notice in this list, what we're going to do is select the pictures library. So that'll be the starting location. And we can also set the picker view mode. So if I say view mode equals, and you'll see we get two options here, list or thumbnail, and what I want to do is see thumbnail. And what that'll do is display our files as thumbnails. Now the next thing we're going to do is just add a filter, and I'll say filter to include a sample subset of the file types. And we want to filter to different file types, including bitmap, PNG, and JPEG. So first let's just do open filter, file type filter, and let's clear. And now let's just add some, and I'll say open picker, file type filter dot add, and we'll add a bitmap first. And I'll just copy and paste this a couple times to add a couple different types. So for this one, let's go ahead and call this PNG. Let's add JPEG, JPEG, and JPEG, JPG. Now we've set up a bunch of properties on our file picker. Now we actually need to open the file picker. So let's just add a quick comment here. We're going to open the file picker, and we're going to do that by dimming a file, and we're going to use a wait keyword because the open picker call, and we can set pick single file async. It's an async call, so we want to await until this async operation's done, and when it is, it'll set values for this file. So with that done, the next thing we want to do is actually make sure the file is not null. So we'll say file is null if user cancels the file picker. We do want to make sure we're checking for that. We'll say if file is not nothing, then next we're going to open a stream for the selected file. And let's just build a variable to represent our file stream. And we're going to use our await keyword because what we're going to do is call into the file.openAsync method. And notice this takes two options, whether we're going to read or read write. For our app, we just need read access. And this will open our data as a file stream. And in our next step, what we're going to do is set the image source to the selected bitmap. Let me scroll down here. And we'll use a bitmap image equals new. This time we're looking at windows.ui.xaml.media.imaging bitmap image. And in the bitmap image, you'll notice there's a call to set source. And from here, what we can do is just set our file stream object that we created earlier. And now back on our photo page XAML, we declared a display image, and what we're going to do is set the source property, and the source property is expecting a bitmap image class, so we'll go ahead and set this to the bitmap image. And the last thing we need to do is set the data context for the photopage.xaml page equal to the storage file that we opened earlier. And now we've written a lot of code, and let's just review everything that's going on within this get photo button click event. And what I'll do is just add a line break to make this a little easier to follow. But the first thing we're going to do is make sure that we are not in the snapped view state. And if we are, we're going to go ahead and try to unsnap as well. And the reason for that is because the file picker APIs don't work if the app is in a snap state. So assuming we're in portrait or landscape mode, for example, what we're going to do is build a file open picker, and we call that file open picker, and we set a couple different properties, like where we're going to start looking for pictures first, how we want our open picker to view, and we want to be able to see thumbnails, and then what files to filter on, and these are image filters like bitmap, PNG, and JPEG. Once we set those properties, we actually are going to display the file picker by calling the pick single file async method call. Once this async method returns, we should have a file here, and we'll go ahead and make sure it's not null. But if we do have a file, what we want to do is open that storage file asynchronously to read the data, and then to display an image in our display image, we need to set the source to something like a bitmap image. So we build a bitmap image and set its source to the file stream, which is the contents of the image that was returned from the file async operation. And finally, we set the source to the display image to our newly built bitmap image. And this last line of code, the data context code, is going to allow us to data bind UI elements to properties of this storage file. The data context property lets you set the default binding for an entire UI element, including all of its child elements. Step 2, bind UI controls to file data. To bind controls to data, the first thing we're going to do is make sure we have the photo page.xaml visible. And the first binding that we're going to set up is the text block, the big one, directly under the Get Photo button. And make sure that's selected and go to the Properties window and make sure that we're seeing the list of properties. And under the Common category, go ahead and select the property marker and select Create Data Binding. And in the binding type, what we're going to do is bind to the data context. So select data context here. And now we're going to add a path, and this represents the name of the property that we want to bind to. And we're going to set it to the display name for that storage file. And note the message in the Create Data Binding dialog says the data context is not set. That's okay because we're actually going to set the data context in our code when you run the app and get a picture. Let's go ahead and click OK. Now we're going to do the same exact things here. Let's go ahead and just zoom in and select this text block right after file name. And let's set that data binding. So with that selected, switch to our Properties window. We're going to create a data binding. In our data binding window, select the data context, just like we did before. And now we're going to set this name for the path and click OK. And let's set our next text block, and this is going to be the path. So select that text block, back to our Properties window here. Select Create Data Binding. And binding type, data context. And this time the path is going to be the word path. A little confusing there, but that's the path to the file. And click OK. And select the last value here, date created, for this text block. And just like before, let's go to our Properties window. Select the property marker, hit Create Data Binding. Switch the binding type to data context. And in the path, this time, what we're going to set this to is date created. And go ahead and click OK. Now when photo page first loads, the data context is going to be null. What that means is the data binding is going to fail silently, and there's going to be no value set for these text blocks. Now let's see this in action by clicking F5 or Run here. Right-click to see our app bar, select Pictures, and right now our data context is null, so nothing's shown within these property text blocks. But let's click Get Photo, and here we're in our Pictures library, and I just have one image here. I'm going to go ahead and select that image and click Open. And first we see our image, but we also see the display name, the file name, the path, and the date created for our image. Alright, let's switch back to Visual Studio and go ahead and stop debugging. Step 3, Save and Load State. Now in part 2 of this tutorial series, Manage App Lifecycle and State, you learned how to save and restore the app state. Now that you've added a new page to the app, you need to save and load the state of the new page too. For the photo page, you only need to save and restore the currently displayed image. But you can't just save the path to the file and then reopen it using that path. When a user picks a file with the File Open Picker, they implicitly give your app permission to that file. If you try to later retrieve the file using just the path, the permission is denied. Instead, to preserve access to the file for later use, the Storage Application Permissions class provides two lists where you can store the file name and its permissions that were granted when the user opened it with the File Open Picker. Now the first list is the most recently used list, and that's used to store the last 25 files accessed. And the other list is the Future Access list, and that's used for general storage of up to 1,000 files for future access. For our app, we only need access to the last file the user picked, so you can use it to restore the page state. For this, the most recently used list fits our needs. So when a user picks a file by clicking the Get Photo button and showing the File Open Picker, we're going to add that selected file to the most recently used list. So what we can do is save that token to our page state dictionary and use it to retrieve the current image file when we restore the page state. So to get started, what we're going to do is jump back to our photopage.xaml.vb file. And at the very top of our page, we're going to declare a variable to hold our most recently used token, also called MRU token. And we'll just declare this right here, and we'll make this private, and we'll call our variable MRU for most recently used, and it's going to be a string. And for now, let's just set it to nothing. Now to set this string value, we're going to go down to our photo button click event, and within this file, once we actually have a file which is within this code, we're going to add one more piece of code at the very end here. Let's add a quick comment here, and we'll just say add picked file to most recently used list, and we'll set our MRU token equal to windows.storage.accessCache.storage application permissions most recently used list, and we're going to call the add method and add that file. What we've done is build a string to represent the token that is going to be returned to us when we call most recently used list and call the add method with our new file. And we can use this token to reload our image. We're going to do two things: save the state and load the state. And let's do the save state first. Go up to the save state method, and let's make sure we're saving our MRU token. So we'll say if not string is null or empty, we'll pass in the MRU token. And assuming we have an MRU token, we're going to add something to the page state, and let's just call this and say page state. Let's call the value we're going to add MRU token, and we'll set it to our MRU token value. And at this point, we've saved our MRU token to session state data whenever the save state method gets called. Next, we want to add code to load our image using that MRU token. So go to the load state method, and first make sure that we're adding the async keyword, since we're going to use some async code in here. And the first thing we'll do is just check whether the page state is not nothing. So page state actually has a value. And the other check we're going to do is to make sure that our key exists. So we'll go to page state and say contains key. And if you remember, the key we called this was MRU token. And if that's true, let's try and retrieve the value for that MRU token. So we'll do dim value as object equals nothing. So we're going to try and get the value out here. And we'll do that using if page state try get value. And we're going to try and get out the MRU token and set it to the value variable that we created a little earlier. Let's do another if statement to check if the value isn't null. Let's say if value is not nothing. Now we're going to set the value of the MRU token string, MRU token, equals that value, and we'll call toString here. Now that we've validated that we actually have a token, what we're going to do is open the file via the token that we stored when adding this file into the MRU list. To do that, I'll just create a variable named dimFile, and we're going to await a call into Windows. This is going to be a little bit of a long one. Windows.storage.accessCache storage application permissions most recently used list. And last time, you remember, we added a file. This time we're going to call getFileAsync, and this is expecting a token, so I'm going to pass in our MRU token. So by calling our getFileAsync and passing in our most recently used token, this is going to return a storage file for us that then we can reuse the same code that we did before in the button click event handler. So now that we have a storage file, we can reuse our code from getPhotoButtonClick. And for simplicity, what I'm going to do is just copy paste all the code within this if file is not nothing, copy it onto my clipboard, go back up to our load state method, and add a line break within this if to paste it all in. And let's do a quick recap on what the load state method does. The first thing we're going to do is validate that our page state isn't null, and then we actually have a key named MRU token. Next, we're going to call try_get_value to actually get the value of MRU token, and assuming the value isn't null, we're going to call the toString method to get the most recently used token. Once we have this most recently used token, we can go to our storage application permissions to the most recently used list and call getFileAsync to load a file by using the token. And at this point, we have a reference to a storage file. We can do a quick check to make sure that file isn't null, and we'll reuse the code that we've done before to open a file stream, to create a bitmap image, and set the source to that file stream, and set the source property for our XAML image element to that newly created bitmap image, and set the data context equal to the selected file. All right, let's see it in action. Let's go ahead and click F5 or Run here. Right-click, select Pictures, click the Get Photo button, and let's go ahead and select that photo and click Open. And at this point, we have that most recently used token. What we want to do is test suspending our application, so let's switch back to Visual Studio, click Alt-Tab, and if you remember from Part 2, Manage App Lifecycle and State, we're going to go here and select Suspend and Shut Down to simulate suspending and terminating our app, and go ahead and click Run again. And notice we landed on our photo page, and what actually happened here is that we loaded the file using getFileAsync from that most recently used list by providing that MRU token. Congratulations, you've completed the 4th tutorial. You learned how to call the File Picker API, how to data bind to properties of a file, and how to preserve access to a file using the Storage Application Permissions class.